By the time I arrived at the hotel, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving behind the last sickly streaks of daylight smeared across the sky. The drive had been long, the road winding and barren, stretching through endless miles of nothingness. I hadn't passed another car for nearly an hour before finally spotting the flickering neon sign on the side of the road. The hotel stood alone, an aging structure leaning against the wind, its wooden frame groaning under the weight of time. The paint had long since peeled away, exposing the brittle, gray skin of the building. The windows were dark, and the air carried the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. Inside, the reception area was dimly lit by a single yellow bulb, casting long, uneasy shadows across the room. The desk sat beneath a wall of keys, each dangling from an old brass hook, most of them untouched for what looked like years. A fan spun lazily overhead, barely stirring the stagnant air. The receptionist barely acknowledged me at first, his face expressionless, worn like the rest of the building. His sunken eyes, rimmed with deep shadows, flickered up only when I placed my hand on the counter. Without a word, he reached behind him and plucked a key from the wall, the brass tag stamped with the number 307. As he slid it across the counter, his bony fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze locking onto mine with something unreadable. The words that followed should have meant nothing. They should have been another one of those local superstitions, designed to lure in curious travelers. A gimmick, a story. But something about the way he said it, slowly, deliberately, with no amusement in his voice, unsettled me in a way I couldn't quite place. I didn't respond, just nodded, pocketing the key. Whatever cryptic warning he was offering, it didn't matter. I was exhausted. My only concern was a bed, a shower, and a few hours of sleep before getting back on the road. The hallway leading to my room was narrow, lined with faded floral wallpaper curling at the edges. The carpet, once red, had darkened with years of wear, its intricate patterns dulled by footsteps long since faded. The number plaques on the doors were mismatched, some missing screws, hanging at odd angles. My room was as uninspiring as the rest of the hotel. A small bed, a desk, and a wardrobe. A single lamp bathed everything in dull amber light, casting weak shadows against the walls. The air was thick, carrying the faint scent of old fabric and something stale beneath it. I dropped my bag onto the bed and rubbed my eyes. The weight of the journey clung to me like an old coat, but sleep felt distant, unreachable. There was an unease that settled in my stomach, something I couldn't quite shake. I tried to distract myself with food. The hotel's diner was empty save for a single waitress who moved with sluggish familiarity, barely glancing at me as she placed a plate of food on the table. The meal was unremarkable, overcooked, flavorless, but I ate it in silence, my thoughts circling back to the receptionist's words. It was ridiculous. A locked room. A warning. It was the kind of thing you'd expect to hear in an old ghost story. The kind whispered among travelers for a cheap thrill. I had no intention of entertaining it. But still, as I climbed the stairs back to my room, I found my eyes flickering toward the door labeled 308. It looked like any other door. Dark wood, brass handle, a tarnished keyhole beneath it. No strange markings, no eerie light spilling from the cracks. Nothing that suggested it was different from the rest. And yet, the presence of it felt different, as though it carried weight, a quiet pressure against the air. The hall was silent. Not just quiet, but silent. So much so that I could hear the faint hum of my own breathing. The old wooden walls groaned as I stepped closer to my room. The floor creaked beneath my weight, the sound swallowed too quickly by the thick, stale air. A draft slithered through the hall, raising the hairs on my arms. Inside my room, I locked the door behind me, twisting the latch until I heard the click echo in the stillness. The thought of room 308 should have faded by now. It should have been nothing more than a passing curiosity. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I could feel it pressing against the edges of my mind, curling around my thoughts like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. The silence of the hotel wasn't comforting. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet that made sleep easy. It was the kind of quiet that felt wrong, too heavy, too absolute. And no matter how much I told myself it was nothing, that it was just another door in an old, empty hotel, I knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it. Midnight arrived like a whisper, slipping into the stale air of the hotel without a sound. Sleep had eluded me, its absence leaving me restless, shifting in the stiff sheets that smelled faintly of dust and something older beneath it. The mattress creaked with each movement, the bed frame groaning under my weight. Outside the window, the wind carried a low, hollow sound, but it was not enough to drown out the silence pressing in from the hallway. The thought had been circling in my mind for hours now, refusing to loosen its grip. Room 308. The warning. The way the air had thickened when I walked past its door, the way it felt different from the others despite its unremarkable appearance. It was ridiculous, and yet the idea of it gnawed at me. The room felt suffocating. The single lamp cast a pool of weak light, its glow not reaching the corners. Shadows pooled in the spaces between the furniture, unmoving, watching. My heartbeat was slow but heavy, a dull thud against my ribs as I sat up. I already knew what I was going to do. The hallway was colder than before, the air heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. The floor groaned softly beneath my steps, but the sound seemed absorbed too quickly, swallowed by the stillness. The walls pressed in on either side, the faded wallpaper curling at the edges like withered skin. The flickering light above room 308 pulsed with an irregular rhythm, buzzing faintly, a broken heartbeat in the silence. The brass numbers on the door were dulled with age, the metal warped slightly, as if touched too many times. The keyhole below the handle gleamed under the dim glow, an unblinking eye waiting to be looked through. I hesitated, breath shallow, heart thrumming against my ribs. There was nothing to be afraid of. It was just a door, just a keyhole. And yet, as I lowered myself to my knees, as my eye aligned with the small opening, I felt a pulse of something wrong. I looked. At first, I expected darkness. An empty room, unlit and abandoned, nothing but dust settling in the corners. Instead, I saw red. Not the red of walls, not the red of furniture or fabric. No texture, no movement. Just red. A deep, endless, impossible shade that swallowed everything else. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't something covering the lens of my vision. It was inside the room. A slow, unnatural dizziness coiled around my skull, the edges of my sight blurring. My heartbeat faltered, my breathing shallow. My head pulsed, a dull ache seeping into my thoughts, filling them with static. The keyhole was too small to be seeing so much. The depth of the red was infinite, stretching beyond logic, beyond walls, beyond the boundaries of a single hotel room. A single, suffocating thought pressed itself into my mind. It's looking back at me. My balance faltered, and I stumbled backward, breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My limbs felt sluggish, the weight of something unseen pressing against my chest. The walls seemed closer now, the dim light above me flickering more erratically, as if struggling against something unseen. Somewhere, deep in the silence, I thought I heard a sound. Not a creak of old wood, not the groan of the hotel shifting against the wind. A breath, soft, slow, close. The air around me felt thick, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. My thoughts scrambled for logic, for an explanation, but there was none. There was only the red. And then I was moving, my legs unsteady beneath me as I pushed away from the door, fumbling for the handle to my own room. The lock clicked open with a sound that felt too loud, too sharp in the deadened air. Inside, I collapsed onto the bed, my breath coming in ragged bursts. My skin was clammy, slick with cold sweat, the scent of it mixing with the stale air of the room. The lamp still burned, casting its weak glow over the walls, but it felt distant, useless against the weight of what I had seen. The red had been inside my mind. It had wrapped around my thoughts, curling into the space behind my eyes. The dizziness still lingered, a faint static hum in the back of my skull. I forced my eyes shut, but sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, it brought something with it. A dream. A figure standing in the center of a room with no walls, bathed in the same deep, endless red. No features, no details, just the suggestion of a presence. Something there, but not there. Watching, waiting. I did not wake peacefully. The moment my consciousness returned, my body jerked forward, hands clutching the sheets, breath ragged, heartbeat erratic. The room was still dim, the weak glow of the lamp barely touching the corners. The silence was heavy, pressing in from all sides. I didn't look at the door. I didn't check the hallway. I didn't want to know if something had followed me back. Morning arrived sluggishly, the weak light bleeding through the curtains, offering no real sense of warmth. It felt unnatural, as though the sun itself had been dimmed, its usual brilliance dulled by something unseen. My body was heavy with exhaustion, my limbs reluctant to move. Sleep had come in fractured pieces, restless and thick with shadows. The memory of that endless red was still imprinted behind my eyelids. Even with my feet planted firmly on the floor, with daylight filtering in, the unease remained. It clung to me, sinking beneath my skin, refusing to dissipate. The air in my room felt different, subtly altered. My suitcase had shifted a few inches from where I had left it. The glass of water on the bedside table was now empty, though I had no memory of drinking it. The blanket, once neatly tucked, had been disturbed, yet I had barely moved all night. These details should have been trivial, easy to dismiss as the restless movements of sleep, but they weren't. They were wrong. A hollow feeling settled in my gut. I needed answers. The receptionist was where I had left him the night before, sitting behind the counter like he had never moved. His expression was unreadable, sunken eyes flickering upward as I approached. There was hesitation in his gaze, something guarded, but he already knew why I had come. There was a story to room 308, one that was never meant to be spoken aloud. Years ago, when the hotel was still new, a woman had been murdered inside that room. No one knew why she had been staying there. No records, no relatives, no history. She had checked in alone, and she had died alone. The details of her death were vague, lost in the hotel's rotting history, but it had not been peaceful. Something brutal had happened behind that door, something that left its mark. In the years that followed, guests who stayed in the rooms nearby reported strange occurrences. Whispers seeping through the walls at night, the feeling of being watched from the hallway, the unmistakable weight of a presence, and always the sensation that someone stood just beyond the door of 308, waiting. Those who had dared to look through the keyhole saw something strange. A shape moving, a shadow pacing, a figure standing perfectly still in the center of the room. But the ones who saw nothing at all were the ones who truly suffered. Because when the void swallowed the room, when the blackness was replaced by something unnatural, those were the ones who spoke of the red. The most unsettling detail, the one whispered in hushed tones by the few who still remembered, was this. The woman who died in room 308 had been described as unnatural, her eyes a shade of red so deep they seemed to burn. No one could remember her face, only those eyes that did not belong to anything human. A sickness twisted in my stomach. I had seen nothing but red. I had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. For the rest of the day, the sense of unease did not leave me. The air in the hotel carried a charge, a pressure against my skin. The walls seemed closer, the hallways subtly narrower. The lights flickered more frequently, casting warped shadows along the floor. Inside my room, things continued to move when I wasn't looking. The chair beside the desk had turned slightly toward the bed. My toothbrush, once inside my bag, now lay on the counter near the sink. The lamp on the nightstand flickered, though the bulb had been steady the night before. These shifts were small, almost meaningless, but they felt intentional. A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. Gone the second, I turned my head. A pressure settled against my spine, the unmistakable weight of being watched. The sense of isolation had deepened. There were no other guests, no voices drifting through the halls, no sounds of movement from below. The hotel felt abandoned, caught in a moment between existence and nothingness. By evening, The sky had darkened, and my resolve had weakened. I should leave. The thought gnawed at me, rational and insistent. Pack my bags, walk out the front door, and never look back. But something kept me there. A presence. A pull. Night arrived, like an intruder. The weight of it pressed against my chest, thick and suffocating. The dim lamp barely illuminated the room, its light struggling against the darkness that pooled in the corners. The door to the hallway stood shut, locked, but it did not feel closed. I tried to sleep. I forced my body still, slowed my breathing, ignored the twisting unease that curled inside my ribs. The hotel was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that is not natural, but manufactured. An absence of sound rather than the presence of peace. And then, at midnight, the sound came. A tap. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against my door. The rhythm was measured, intentional. Not the random creaks of an old building. Not the shifting of wood against the cold. It was precise. Someone, or something, was knocking. My breath halted, my body frozen beneath the sheets. The air inside the room had changed, growing thick, heavy with something unseen. The tap came again, steady, unhurried. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the sound to be a trick of my mind. But it was not. It was outside my door, and it was waiting for me to answer. The tapping did not stop. It came in slow, deliberate pulses, tap, tap, tap. Each one impossibly soft, yet somehow filling the room like a distant echo inside my own skull. It was patient. It was expectant. The sound crawled beneath my skin, pressing into my ribcage, coiling deep in my gut. The weight of the air had thickened, pressing against my lungs, making each breath a slow, trembling effort. My fingers clenched around the bed sheets, my body rigid, as though any movement might shatter the fragile barrier between myself and the thing just beyond the door. The sensible part of me screamed to stay where I was. Do not move. Do not acknowledge it. Do not let it know that I was listening. But another part, something deeper, something older, was already responding. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't bravery. It was something else. A pull, a quiet demand pressing against my skull, urging me forward. I did not remember leaving the bed, but my bare feet were already against the floor, the cold seeping into my bones. The walls of the room felt too narrow now, the air too dense, the space too small. The tapping continued, rhythmic and unhurried, like something waiting. I knew what I was going to do before I had even reached the door. The keyhole gleamed under the dim glow of the bedside lamp. A small, unassuming slit of brass, yet it felt like an open wound, a tiny, gaping mouth. The air around it was wrong, colder, thicker, alive. I should not have looked, but I did. This time, there was no red. Instead, there was a woman. She stood in the center of room 308, facing the door. Her figure was dark against the pale light of the single overhead bulb. Perfectly still, perfectly silent. Something was wrong with her shape. Her arms hung too long at her sides, the fingers barely visible but wrong, the angles unnatural, the joints misplaced. Her posture was rigid, spine locked in an unnatural stillness, as though her body was not used to standing. Her head was tilted at a sickening angle, not quite backward, not quite to the side, just off. I could not see her eyes, but I could feel them. The air inside my room had changed. A thick pressure against my skull, an unnatural hum that vibrated against my ribs. Her breath was inside my head. It was not a sound. It was a presence. A slow exhale brushing against the inside of my thoughts. She had seen me. I knew it before she moved. A sudden jerk, a spasm, unnatural and violent. The figure inside room 308 did not step forward. It lunged, body convulsing as if suddenly yanked forward by invisible strings. I wrenched myself backward from the door just as the doorknob rattled violently. The entire frame shook. A sound like bones scraping against wood, like fingernails clawing against the grain. The knob twisted, jerking back and forth, something on the other side desperate to open it. The weight of the air crashed down on my chest, making my breaths come in sharp, ragged bursts. Then, the movement stopped. a silence more suffocating than the noise that had preceded it. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, filling the void where the rattling had been. The doorknob remained still, the air heavy and waiting. And then, a voice, not from the other side of the door, not from the hallway, from inside my own skull. Fragile, broken, soft as crumpled paper, yet loud enough to drown out everything else. I see you. The whisper curled inside my mind, impossible, invasive, slipping between my thoughts like it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. A single sob pressed against my throat, strangled and soundless. I stumbled backward, my legs unsteady beneath me. My body felt wrong, my limbs slow, my head thick with static. The lamp on the nightstand flickered, dimming for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the shadows in the room to shift. The air pressed against my ears. The walls fell closer. Something had changed. Something had moved. I did not turn to look. I did not want to know if I was still alone. He had to leave. The thought struck with absolute certainty, an instinctive alarm buried deep in the marrow of his bones. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to run. Not later, not when the sun rose, but now. He could not spend another second in this room, in this hotel, with whatever was on the other side of that door. His breath came in shallow gasps, his lungs barely filling. The air inside the room had grown heavier, thicker, clinging to his skin like damp cloth. The silence was no longer empty. It was watching. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against him from every direction. He didn't hesitate. The suitcase was barely zipped before he was gripping it in one hand, the other fumbling with the latch on the door. His pulse pounded against his skull, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump matching the frantic thoughts crashing through his mind. The lock clicked open. The hallway beyond should have been familiar, but the moment he stepped out, he knew something was wrong. It was longer than before, much longer. The walls stretched outward, the dim sconces flickering along an impossible corridor that had not existed when he had arrived. The doors lining either side no longer made sense. Numbers repeated, some missing digits entirely, others appearing twice. Room 303 stood beside 312, and just beyond that was another 307. The hallway breathed. The wallpaper rippled, as though something pulsed beneath it, pressing outward, struggling against its confinement. The floor swelled beneath his feet, soft as flesh, the sensation sending a violent shudder through his body. He turned toward the lobby, the exit. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound swallowed too quickly by the thick air. The further he walked, the further the lobby seemed to stretch away from him. The walls curved inward, narrowing, the ceiling dipping lower. He was not getting closer. A sound stopped him, a slow, deliberate click. Behind him, room 308's keyhole blinked open. A grotesque red eye, slick and pulsing, stared out from the brass slit, the pupil dilating as if adjusting to the dim hallway light. The handle twisted. The door creaked open, inch by inch, revealing only a black void beyond its threshold. A rush of hot, rotting breath spilled into the hall. The scent was unbearable. Decay, blood, something old and damp and raw. His stomach lurched, while rising in his throat. From the darkness, something moved. A pale, clawed hand emerged from the blackness, its fingers impossibly long, stretching outward, searching. The skin was cracked and slick with something viscous, each joint bending too far, the nails curling into wicked points. He stumbled backward. The hand lunged for him. The last thing he saw was the stretch of fingers reaching for his throat, the black abyss yawning open beyond them. And then, nothing. Epilogue. Days passed before another traveler arrived. The hotel stood as it always had, leaning against the weight of time, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. The air was thick with the scent of rain, the pavement still damp from a passing storm. Inside, the receptionist sat behind the desk, unmoving. His skin was pale, hollow, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. The wall of keys behind him gleamed under the dim light, each tag swaying slightly, as if disturbed by a phantom breeze. A tired man placed his bag beside him, rubbing his temple as he pulled out his wallet. The receptionist did not ask for a name. A key was already waiting on the counter, the brass tag glinting beneath the light. 307. As the man reached for it, the receptionist exhaled slowly, his voice thin, distant, as though carried from somewhere far away. The warning was the same as it had always been. Do not open the door to room 308. And do not, under any circumstances, look through the keyhole.